The October rain lashed against the windows of Baker Street that dark evening when Professor Edmund Ashworth arrived at our door, his eyes wild with terror and his hands trembling uncontrollably. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest as though it contained something precious yet profoundly dangerous. Holmes, who had been studying chemical compounds at his bench, looked up with immediate interest at the disturbance. Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Mr. Holmes, the professor gasped, barely able to form words through his evident distress. I have in my possession a manuscript that has driven 3 men to madness and death. I fear I shall be the 4th unless you can solve its terrible secret before it claims me as well. Holmes indicated a chair by the fire, and I immediately went to examine our visitor's condition. His pulse was racing, his pupils dilated with fear rather than chemical influence, and his entire demeanor suggested genuine psychological trauma rather than deception or theatrics. Compose yourself, Professor, Holmes said calmly, his gray eyes fixed intently on our visitor. Begin at the beginning and tell us everything about this manuscript. What is it? Where did it come from? And what has happened to those who have encountered it? Professor Ashworth took several deep breaths, accepted the brandy I offered him, and began his extraordinary account. I am a professor of medieval studies at Cambridge University, specializing in manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries. 3 months ago, an antiquarian bookseller in London contacted me about an unusual find. A manuscript dating from approximately 1347, written in a mixture of Latin and early English, purportedly containing the secret journals of a Franciscan monk who survived the early waves of the Black Death. The content itself? Holmes prompted. Ostensibly, it describes the monk's observations of the plague as it swept through Europe. But there is something more. Passages written in cipher, illustrations that seem to move when one stares at them too long, and sections that appear to be instructions for some kind of ritual or ceremony. The bookseller, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, was eager to sell it, claiming it made him uncomfortable. I purchased it for the university collection for £200. And then? I asked, seeing the professor's hands begin to shake again. Within a week of acquiring the manuscript, Blackwood was found dead in his shop. The police ruled it suicide. He had hanged himself. But his assistant told me that in his final days, he had spoken of nightmares, of voices calling to him from the manuscript, of visions of plague victims reaching out to him. I dismissed this as superstition at the time. Holmes leaned forward. Continue. I began my analysis of the manuscript at Cambridge. My research assistant, a brilliant young scholar named Thomas Hartwell, helped me with the translation work. We spent hours poring over the text, attempting to decipher the coded passages. After 2 weeks, Thomas began exhibiting strange behavior. He claimed the manuscript was cursed, that it contained knowledge man was not meant to possess. He spoke of shadows moving in the margins of the pages, of whispers emanating from the illustrations. His colleagues thought he was overworked. But then, one night, he threw himself into the River Cam and drowned. They found him the next morning. "Most disturbing," Holmes murmured. "And the third victim?" Dr. Richard Pemberton, one of my colleagues in the Medieval Studies department. After Thomas's death, Richard offered to help me complete the translation. He was a skeptic, dismissive of any notion that a manuscript could be dangerous beyond its historical content. But within 10 days of working with the document, his personality changed dramatically. He became paranoid, aggressive, sleepless. He claimed the manuscript was alive, that it was feeding on those who read it. Last week he attacked a student with a letter opener, convinced she was a plague demon sent to steal his soul. He is now confined to Bethlehem Hospital, completely insane. Holmes rose and began pacing, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And you yourself have been working with this manuscript?" "For the past month, yes. And I have begun to experience the same symptoms. Nightmares of medieval plague pits. Visions of diseased figures reaching toward me. A persistent sense that something malevolent resides within those pages. I hear whispers when I'm alone with it, Mr. Holmes. I see movement in the illustrations when logic tells me there can be none. I fear my mind is deteriorating, just as theirs did." "Yet you brought it here," Holmes observed. "Why?" "Because you are my last hope. If anyone can discover what is actually causing these effects, whether it is truly some supernatural curse or something more rational that I am too compromised to perceive, it is you. The manuscript is in this portfolio. I dare not open it myself again. I have not looked at it for 3 days, and already I feel somewhat clearer in mind. But the effects linger. The nightmares continue." Holmes examined the leather portfolio without opening it. "Professor, I must ask you some very specific questions. Did all 3 victims handle the manuscript with bare hands?" "Yes, of course. One must be careful with medieval documents. But we wore no special protection beyond ensuring our hands were clean." "And the manuscript itself, describe its physical condition. The paper, the ink, any unusual characteristics." Professor Ashworth closed his eyes, clearly reluctant to visualize it. "The parchment is yellowed with age, but remarkably well preserved. The ink is a deep brown-black, likely iron gall ink, as was common in that period. But there are illustrations done in other pigments, reds, greens, a particularly vivid blue. The binding is later, perhaps 16th century, and there is an unusual quality to the pages. They feel slightly oily to the touch, and they have a distinctive smell, somewhat sweet, but also acrid." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Oily and sweet-smelling. Most interesting indeed. Professor, I shall examine this manuscript, but not tonight. You are exhausted, and your faculties are compromised. Watson will see you to a hotel for the night. I recommend Claridge's, and the expense shall be mine. Tomorrow, when you are rested, we shall discuss this matter further. In the meantime, the manuscript stays here, unopened. After Professor Ashworth had departed, with clear relief at being separated from the cursed document, Holmes immediately turned to me with a look of grim determination. Watson, we are dealing with poison, not supernatural forces. Those symptoms, paranoia, hallucinations, aggression, eventual madness, they are classic signs of certain toxic exposures. But how could a manuscript be poisonous? I asked, struggling to understand. Through the pigments used in its illustrations. Medieval manuscripts often employed toxic substances in their inks and paints. Cinnabar for red, mercuric sulfide. Verdigris for green, copper acetate. Orpiment for yellow, arsenic trisulfide. And most dangerous of all, a pigment known as folium, or sometimes dragon's blood, which, when made improperly, could contain significant quantities of ergot alkaloids. Ergot, I said, my medical training suddenly making the connection. The fungus that grows on rye. But that causes ergotism, convulsions, mania, hallucinations. The dancing plague of the Middle Ages was attributed to ergot poisoning. Precisely, Watson. And if this manuscript was created during or shortly after the Black Death, when food supplies were contaminated and knowledge of proper preparation was scarce, it is entirely possible that ergot found its way into the pigments. Anyone handling the manuscript extensively would absorb the toxins through their skin. The cumulative effect over days or weeks would be precisely what the professor described: hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually, complete mental breakdown. But Holmes, I protested, if it is simply poisoning, why did the manuscript appear to have supernatural properties? The moving illustrations, the voices? Ergot is a powerful hallucinogen, Watson. Those who have been exposed would genuinely perceive these phenomena. To them, the manuscript truly is alive, truly is cursed. Their minds, poisoned by the alkaloids, create vivid hallucinations that seem entirely real. The medieval monk who created it may have been suffering from ergotism himself, which would explain the bizarre content and the cipher. Perhaps not a code at all, but the ravings of a poisoned mind. Then everyone who has handled it has been slowly poisoning themselves, I said, horrified. But how do we prove this without exposing ourselves to the same danger? Holmes smiled grimly. We conduct a chemical analysis of the pigments without extensive handling. Tomorrow, I shall carefully extract minute samples from the manuscript and test them for ergot alkaloids and other toxic compounds. If my theory is correct, we shall find concentrations sufficient to explain all the symptoms. The next morning brought Professor Ashworth back to Baker Street, looking somewhat recovered after a night's rest away from the manuscript. Holmes had spent the early hours preparing his chemical apparatus and setting up a series of tests. With meticulous care, using long tweezers and working in a well-ventilated area by the open window, he opened the portfolio and extracted the manuscript. Even from across the room, I could see it was a remarkable document. The parchment pages were covered with dense Latin text, and scattered throughout were vivid illustrations of plague scenes, skeletal figures, suffering victims, and strange geometric patterns that did seem to shift and move when one stared at them too long. But Holmes had warned me not to look directly at the pages, and I heeded his advice. Using a scalpel, Holmes carefully scraped tiny samples of pigment from several of the illustrations: the red, the green, and particularly the blue, which he suspected most strongly. He placed each sample in a separate glass dish and began his analysis. Professor Ashworth watched with a mixture of hope and residual fear. For 2 hours, Holmes worked in concentrated silence, adding reagents, observing reactions, making notes. I busied myself with attending to his needs, bringing fresh solutions, recording his observations, ensuring proper ventilation. Finally, he straightened up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "As I suspected," he announced, "the blue pigment contains significant quantities of ergot alkaloids, ergotamine and ergometrine. The concentration is remarkably high, likely because the monk who prepared it used contaminated materials. Anyone handling this manuscript extensively would absorb these compounds through their skin, and given sufficient exposure, would experience all the symptoms you have described." Professor Ashworth looked stunned. "Then there is no curse? No supernatural malevolence?" "None whatsoever. You and your colleagues have been victims of ergot poisoning. Nothing more. Though I hasten to add that the effects are no less real for having a chemical rather than supernatural cause. The hallucinations you experienced were genuinely perceived by your compromised nervous system." "But why did I begin to recover when I stopped handling it?" the professor asked. "Because you ceased exposure to the toxin, allowing your body to gradually eliminate it. With proper medical treatment and complete abstinence from the manuscript, you should recover fully within a few weeks. And the others, Blackwood, Thomas Hartwell, Dr. Pemberton." Holmes's expression grew somber. Blackwood and Hartwell were exposed for shorter periods, but perhaps had greater sensitivity to the toxin, or handled the manuscript more extensively. Dr. Pemberton's case is more serious, but with proper treatment at Bethlehem, he too may recover, though his exposure was more prolonged. Over the following days, Holmes's analysis was confirmed by consulting chemists and medical experts. The manuscript was carefully sealed in a lead-lined box to prevent any further exposure. The authorities at Cambridge were informed, and strict protocols were established for handling toxic manuscripts in the future. Dr. Pemberton was treated with activated charcoal and other agents to help eliminate the ergot alkaloids from his system. And while his recovery was slow, he did eventually regain much of his mental capacity, though he never returned to academic work. Professor Ashworth made a full recovery and wrote a detailed paper on the dangers of toxic pigments in medieval manuscripts, which became required reading for scholars in the field. The manuscript itself, now properly handled with gloves and protective equipment, was fully translated and proved to be exactly what it appeared: the journals of a monk who had himself been suffering from ergotism. His writings a mixture of accurate observation and hallucinatory fantasy. The case had a profound impact on the field of manuscript studies. Holmes's investigation led to the testing of thousands of medieval documents, and numerous other examples of toxic pigments were discovered and properly contained. Lives were undoubtedly saved by this work, though Holmes characteristically refused to take credit, insisting he had merely applied basic chemical knowledge to an obvious problem. Several weeks after the case concluded, Professor Ashworth called at Baker Street to express his gratitude. He brought with him a medieval astronomical manuscript, beautifully illustrated, but thoroughly tested and confirmed to be free of toxic substances, as a gift for Holmes. "You saved my life, Mr. Holmes," he said simply. "And you did so by refusing to believe in curses or supernatural explanations. You looked for the rational cause, and you found it." Holmes accepted the gift with rare warmth. The human mind is quick to attribute to supernatural causes what it does not immediately understand. But in my experience, Professor, there is always a rational explanation if one looks carefully enough. Your manuscript of madness was indeed causing madness, but through chemistry, not magic. After the professor departed, I reflected on the case as I made my notes. Holmes, what strikes me most is how the symptoms themselves reinforced the belief in a curse. The hallucinations made the manuscript seem alive and malevolent. Precisely, Watson. It is a perfect example of how perception shapes belief. Those who handled the manuscript began to hallucinate due to the ergot exposure. These hallucinations naturally focused on the manuscript itself, since that was what they were studying intensely. Their poisoned minds created the very curse they feared, making it seem entirely real to them. Had any of them suspected chemical poisoning from the outset, they would have taken proper precautions and avoided the tragedy. Yet, it is difficult to blame them. Who would suspect a 600-year-old manuscript of being poisonous? Indeed, and therein lies the lesson. Ancient does not mean harmless. Medieval craftsmen regularly worked with substances we now know to be deadly. Lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, all were common in paints, inks, and dyes. Future scholars must learn to treat all historical documents as potentially hazardous until proven otherwise. The case of the Manuscript of Madness remained one of Holmes's most scientifically significant investigations, though it garnered little public attention at the time. The academic world quietly implemented new safety protocols, and the number of mysterious, cursed manuscripts dropped dramatically once proper handling procedures became standard. Years later, I encountered a similar case in my reading, a supposed cursed painting from the 18th century that caused illness in all who owned it. Upon investigation, it was discovered that the green pigment used in the artwork contained arsenic, which had been slowly outgassing for decades, poisoning successive owners. Holmes's investigation of the manuscript had helped establish the precedent for such discoveries. As I completed my notes that evening, Holmes took up his violin and played a haunting medieval melody that seemed appropriate to the case. "Knowledge can be dangerous, Watson," he remarked between movements. "But ignorance is far more so. The monk who created that manuscript 600 years ago had no understanding of the toxins in his pigments. He may well have been poisoning himself as he worked, his mind deteriorating even as he recorded his observations of the plague. His madness was not divine punishment, but simple chemistry." "A tragedy, then, spanning 6 centuries," I observed. "All preventable through knowledge and proper precautions. That is why science matters, Watson. Not to strip the world of mystery or wonder, but to protect us from dangers we might otherwise attribute to malevolent, supernatural forces beyond our control." The manuscript itself was eventually donated to the British Museum, where it remains to this day in a sealed, climate-controlled case, with clear warnings about its toxic content. It serves as both a historical document and a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can lurk in the artifacts of the past. Professor Ashworth lived to be 83 and never handled an unprotected medieval manuscript again. He became an advocate for safety in academic research and helped develop the protocols that are still used in libraries and museums worldwide. In his autobiography, published posthumously, he devoted an entire chapter to his experience with the manuscript and his gratitude to Sherlock Holmes for solving what he had believed to be an unsolvable supernatural mystery. The case also had personal significance for Holmes, as it represented one of his most clear-cut triumphs of rationalism over superstition. He often cited it when discussing the importance of seeking natural explanations before resorting to supernatural ones. "The universe," he once told me, "operates according to consistent physical laws. When something appears to violate those laws, the violation is in our understanding, not in reality." As I filed away my notes on the case weeks later, I reflected on how the investigation had perfectly demonstrated Holmes's methods: careful observation, knowledge of chemistry and toxicology, logical deduction, and systematic testing of hypotheses. What had seemed like an impossible supernatural curse had proven to be entirely explicable through science. The manuscript of madness had indeed caused madness, but not through any malevolent spirit or medieval curse. Instead, it was simply a beautiful but deadly artifact from an age when artisans regularly worked with substances now known to be profoundly toxic. The real curse was ignorance, and the cure was knowledge. precisely the kind of knowledge that Sherlock Holmes dedicated his life to pursuing. In the end, the case served as a reminder that the past is not always safely behind us. The artifacts and documents of previous centuries can carry forward not only knowledge, but also dangers that persist long after their creators have turned to dust. Only through careful scientific investigation and proper precautions can we safely unlock the secrets of history, without falling victim to the same hazards that claimed earlier generations. The manuscript remains in its sealed case at the British Museum, a testament to both medieval craftsmanship and modern scientific understanding. Scholars still study it, but now they do so safely, protected by the knowledge that Holmes's investigation provided. The curse has been broken, not by ritual or prayer, but by chemistry and reason. As Holmes would say, precisely as it should be.